Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 22 in the history series, Rewriting Art History, Part 1, Race and Gender. I'm going to talk first about ways of representing women artists, and second, ways of representing race and ethnicity. So this is the beginning of a series of 4 lectures, numbers 22 through 25, on 10 different problems with the World Art History Survey and the various ways that people have tried to fix them. These are all unresolved problems, so you can think about how you would address each one of them as we go. I'm going to pose them all as questions. I'm going to consider just 2, the first 2 out of the 10 in this lecture. So first, representing women artists. One of the first books on this subject, and definitely the most influential earlier feminist text, is Rosa Parker and Griselda Pollock's Old Mistresses from 1981. It's one of the first attempts to write a feminist history of art, and it has chapters on medieval and pre-modern women artists, in other words, historical chapters, and also theoretical chapters in which they talk about problems of representing women artists. They note that histories of women artists actually began in the mid-19th century with some really obscure historians. Ernst Gould wrote a book called Women in Art History, and Elizabeth Elliot wrote something called Women Artists in All Ages and Countries. They say that these histories became uncommon just as feminism was becoming more widespread. This is an interesting subject, and these authors, Gould and Elliot and others, are very rarely read, and their books actually aren't easy to find. This is one of the very few scholarly articles about Gould on the left, in case you want to try to find out more about him. So Pollock and Parker argue that it's important to, quote, validate women's domestic labor, private and taboo areas of female sexuality, and the craft traditions that have often been gendered female, but that those studies, quote, can run the risk of appearing merely to reconfirm traditional associations of women with the body, the home, and the needle. So they're interested in theoretical problems. How do you justify, how do you explain, and how do you control the meanings of women artists when they're included into the canon? Old Mistresses was largely responsible for adding a number of artists that are now standard in all the surveys. Suzanne Valadon on the last page, on the last screen. Rosalba Carriera, she's there. Sofonisba Anguissala, she was in another one of these history lectures. And Artemisia Gentileschi. They're all in the Art History Survey text. I guarantee you can check your textbook. They're all there. So it was an influential book in that regard. Their argument was that each of these artists managed to work within the limits of her time and place to give an identifiably female perspective to her art. So it was really the representation of gender that mattered. Old Mistresses set a standard for including unfamiliar women artists because they had to demonstrate that they had reversed or appropriated existing male conventions. As an example of how influential that particular strategy is, that criterion for including women artists, there's a book by Susan Suleiman called Subversive Intent about women surrealists. And she argues that women surrealists like Leonora Carrington, Dorothea Tanning, and Leonore Feeney, that they were self-conscious mimics. They were sly imitators of their male counterparts and not just followers. So the reason why they deserve to be in the art history survey, in the canon, in the master narrative and all the rest of it, is because they weren't just followers, they weren't just examples of art movements and ideas that could be found in the mostly male canon that already exists, but that they had an identifiably different position that was enabled by or related to their representation of their gender. Now that's a very fruitful strategy or criterion for inclusion, but there are others. Some scholarship turned away from those arguments in favor of ungendered descriptions. An example of that is the art historian Rosalind Krauss, who wrote a book called Bachelors. It's on 8 women artists. Krauss does away with that kind of special pleading, she says, in order to argue the work's significance without reference to the artist's gender. So in other words, you would be including women artists, more women artists into the textbook, but you wouldn't give any special reference to their gender. You'd just be including them as artists. There's also another strategy in that same book, Krauss's book Bachelors, because she also argues that some women artists were simply as interesting as artists in the canon. So she describes the surrealist photographer Claude Cahun as a complement, equal and opposite complement to Marcel Duchamp. And that's because both of them experimented with their gender. Lucy Schaub renamed herself Claude Cahun, just as Marcel Duchamp once renamed himself Rose Sélavy. Cahun said, quote, "Gender, neuter is the only gender that always suits me," unquote. So the idea there is that Cahun's experimentation with gender ambiguity was as radical as Duchamp's, and therefore Claude Cahun is also appropriate for inclusion in the art history textbook. So here, just to summarize the four strategies I've mentioned so far. First of all, adding women artists to enrich the picture of culture. This was done starting in the 19th century by Gould, Emmett, and others. Each new artist, quote unquote, represents a different aspect of their contemporaneous culture. So every time you add a woman artist who hasn't been taught or studied before, you're enriching culture, enriching understanding of visual culture and of the culture of their time in reference to their representation of gender without any further criteria. Second strategy is to add women artists who change existing conventions. So Parker and Pollock were interested in women artists who questioned stereotypes and received ideas and formed their own style. Same thing that happens in Suleiman's book. Third strategy is adding women artists without noting their gender. And here the idea is just to present an unfamiliar artist just as an artist and not as a woman artist. And then fourth, adding women artists who are as innovative as others already in the canon. Of course, this sets the bar pretty high because then, from an art historian's point of view, you have to find women artists who are doing things as radical as the kinds of things that artists who are already in the textbook are doing. And that's the argument that Krauss makes in relation to Claude Cahun's self-portraits and Duchamp's. So second topic is representing race and ethnicity. Work on race and ethnicity in art history surveys has also made use of these same four strategies. Inclusion and exclusion from art history survey texts has worked differently with different groups. And here I'm just going to consider African American artists, even though it's worth noticing that most new editions of ethnic, indigenous, and minority artists to world art history survey texts have been made to the chapters on American, Mexican, Canadian, and some European countries, and not to countries in other parts of the world which have tended to keep their uniform histories. So diversity itself is unevenly applied in world art history texts. That's not a theme I'm going to be returning to much, but if you ever find yourself in the position of wanting to write one of these texts or needing to teach this, this is an interesting systemic and largely hidden problem. So the first strategy that I mentioned in relation to women artists has also been used in relation to African American artists in art history textbooks. And that is to present the work as expressive of, in this case, in the case of Archibald Motley, it would be expressive of Black culture in America. This is the same as the first strategy for adding women artists to the textbooks. So in this case, Motley, who's, by the way, one of the first Black artists to attend the School of the Art Institute, he's described as a, quote, jazz age modernist who chronicled the 1920s. So the reason for inclusion, or the strategy for inclusion there in the description, in the presentation of Motley in the textbook, is that he represented a part of culture that otherwise would have been unrepresented. The second strategy, that is adding artists who subvert conventions, is still very common. So there was a 2016 exhibition of Motley at the Whitney in New York, and the catalog says, quote, Motley rightly holds a place among the great American modernists. The artist created a far more daring visual language than many of his contemporaries, fusing vivid narrative with dizzying spatial distortion and jarring hues, unquote. So in other words, he deserves a place, he deserves a new exhibition, he deserves a place in history because he changed existing conventions. It's an example of the second strategy, that the artist is of interest because they were aware of their place and in the contemporaneous art scene, and they intervened in it in some way. They subverted strategies, or they changed strategies, or they were knowing in some way about it. An example of the third strategy, that is adding artists without noting their identity, or in the case of women artists, without noting their gender, is discussed in Kimberly Pinder's survey of African American artists in survey texts. That's in this book, Racing Art History. It's a really interesting anthology. Pinder suggests that to some extent, textbooks should dissolve African American examples in the general mix of periods and styles. There's a problem with that solution, as she acknowledges, because it pretends that identity politics can disappear, and it gives up the possibility of affecting, quote, supremacist and patriarchal attitudes. So here again are the four strategies that I've been listing in abbreviated form. They've been used from the 1980s to the present. Art historians have used them to help think about how to diversify art history textbooks and classes. They've all helped to make art history texts more inclusive, and they've had another effect too, which hasn't been written about much, but certainly should be, and that is that they have revealed, since they've become explicit and people have been working on them, they've revealed that art historical narratives have a wide variety of reasons for including canonical artists. The standard narratives of art are made of mixed motivations and justifications, because some artists are in art history texts for several of these reasons at once. Sometimes just one of the reasons, sometimes all four of them at once. But that kind of thing is not always or consistently made explicit. There is a fifth strategy as well, although it's a little bit less of a fifth strategy as it is more of an apples and oranges kind of thing. It adds to the and critiques the entire list of four. The art historian James Smalls has said that art historians need to stop describing black artists in terms of style or social context. Quote, African American art is partially based on pathos, self-doubt, the need to sell a product, that is race, and classism. Scholars need to look more deeply and critically at what they're describing, he says. So this would be a fifth strategy, something like avoid the idea that African American artists stand for or express ideas that are already present in art history. Be aware that the problem can't be solved by increasing diversity in art history surveys. This is one of his essays on the left, in case you want to look it up. Pinder says that neither the critique of stereotypes, that would be the second strategy, nor the avoidance of all mention of ethnic or gendered identity, that would be the third strategy, is sufficient. Art historians should become more reflective about the impossibility of the problem. The construction of race is an impossible condition, and problems can neither be erased nor solved. So this can be thought of as a fifth strategy. It's a different kind of strategy, so I'll just put these on one last time to compare the fifth with the others. So the first one, adding artists who enrich the picture of culture. The second, adding women artists, I should just say artists, who subvert conventions. The third, adding artists without noting their ethnicity or gender. The fourth, adding artists who are as innovative as those already in the canon. And then the fifth would be something like, don't add, but rethink, since the problem can't be solved by adding artists. So in the last 2 decades, there have been no new art history surveys that make headways on these issues, especially on this fifth one. Instead, the existing one-volume surveys just keep growing. The 6th edition of Janssen's textbook was thoroughly rewritten by 6 new historians. So instead of having originally one author, Janssen, then he gave it to his son. His son did revisions. Instead of that, they got a completely new group of people, 6 historians, and they worked in ways that were compatible with this fifth strategy. That's to say, they were trying to rethink how women artists and artists of color could be represented. So I have a screenshot here from a report about it in the New York Times from 2006 when it came out, in which it's a pretty good review because the reviewer understands, or the authors explained that it's really a question of rethinking more than it is a question of inclusion. It's not easy to answer this question, why has the art history survey still not been thoroughly rewritten in relation to these 2 first topics? The consensus answer is that art history is structured by racism and gender bias and other inheritances of colonialism. That's the standard answer. Kamara Holloway, who's writing about the movement called Critical Race Art History in 2016, says, quote, "The aesthetic philosophy that gave birth to the discipline of art history incorporated racialized beliefs into its conceptual frame." And that's true, but it can also be argued that it's not racialized beliefs that are slowing or blocking the inclusion of women artists or artists of color in art history surveys, because hundreds of artists are added in each new edition of the big textbooks, and these editors, the new editors like the ones of the Jansen, have this very much on their mind. So it's not directly a question of that, or it's not solved, you might say, by addressing that. The problem is more like the underlying history and structure of art history, from Hegel to Gombrich and Gardner and Jansen, because the narratives of art history are based on concepts and values that can make additions appear like ornaments or optional enrichments on a fundamental structure. To thoroughly critique and rethink art history, it's necessary to study those structures, and that's what I've been trying to outline in these history lectures, and that's what we're going to look into in these next 3 lectures on 8 more problems that people have had trying to rethink and rewrite the art history survey.